It was early morning, just as the first light filtered through the kitchen window, when Margaret received the call. The quiet in her house was comforting, the kind of silence that follows years of routine. She had just poured herself a cup of tea, her hands still warm from the mug when her phone buzzed on the table. "Hey, just letting you know we're heading to the mountains this weekend." "Everything's sorted," said the cheerful voice on the other end. It was Elise, her daughter-in-law. Her voice was upbeat, light, filled with the anticipation of an upcoming trip. But something about the way she said everything's sorted made Margaret's heart drop. There was no pause, no invitation. No inclusion. "Oh, sounds lovely. I hope you all have a great time," Margaret replied, masking her pain with practiced grace. When the call ended, the silence in the kitchen no longer felt peaceful. It felt hollow. Margaret sat for a moment, her tea untouched. Her thoughts raced, but her body remained still, a habit she'd learned over the years of quietly absorbing life's disappointments. She wasn't upset about the trip itself. Not really. She was upset about what it represented. A quiet exclusion, a new role she hadn't chosen, the forgotten one. Throughout the day, she tried to keep busy. She folded laundry, dusted the picture frames in the hallway, rearranged the flowers on the dining table. But the ache persisted. Her hands moved out of habit, but her heart felt heavier with each passing hour. By afternoon, she walked past the guest room, the one she used to prepare lovingly whenever her son, Aaron, and Elise came to visit. It now stood untouched, its linen stiff from disuse, the air thick with neglect. Her eyes lingered on a photo on the dresser, a snapshot from happier times. Aaron smiling, Elise laughing, Margaret cradling their dog Jasper like he was family. That photo used to make her smile. Today it felt like a relic of a life she no longer belonged to. She made herself lunch, but appetite never came. Instead, she kept hearing Elise's voice in her head. "We've got everything sorted." So simple, so casual, like she didn't even consider the possibility of asking. Maybe she didn't. As the sun began to set, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the room dimly lit by the soft orange glow outside. Her thoughts grew sharper, more painful. She wasn't part of their plans, she wasn't part of their world, she was just there, silent, forgotten. And for the first time in a long while, she admitted it to herself, she felt invisible. But invisibility, Margaret realized, was something she no longer wanted to carry. If they didn't have room for her in their lives, then maybe, just maybe, it was time she created space for herself. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't beg, she wouldn't guilt them into loving her, but she would no longer wait silently on the sidelines. The next day, Elise called again, this time with a favor. "Can you watch Jasper while we're gone? Just feed him and walk him a bit, thanks, Margaret." There was no apology, no recognition, just a favor masked as necessity. And Margaret, with a calm voice and a quiet smile, replied, "Sure." But something inside her had shifted. She looked at Jasper sleeping in his bed later that day and thought, is this what I've become to them? The dog sitter, the backup plan, it wasn't about the dog, it wasn't about the trip. It was about respect, or rather the absence of it. That evening, while slicing vegetables for dinner she wouldn't eat, she checked her bank account. A part of her didn't know what she was looking for. Another part knew exactly what she was about to do. She opened the app and with steady fingers froze the credit cards they often used, her cards. Not out of revenge, not to hurt them, but to remind them she was still here. She mattered. As she pressed confirm, a quiet power rose within her. It was small, it was quiet, but it was the first step in reclaiming her voice. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret wasn't waiting to be seen. She was making herself visible. The morning after she froze the cards, Margaret woke early. The sky outside was still painted in soft hues of lavender and gray, the world not yet fully awake. She wrapped herself in her shawl and made her way to the kitchen, her steps echoing in the stillness. The house had never felt so silent, not in a haunting way, but in a clear, intentional way. She no longer filled her days with distractions. There was no need to cover the ache anymore. She had acknowledged it, looked it straight in the eye. She moved through the motions of her day with unusual clarity, watering her plants, sweeping the porch, even humming softly to herself. But in the back of her mind, she was waiting. She knew the silence wouldn't last. They'd notice. Eventually, and they did. It began with a message from Elise. "Why did you freeze the cards? We can't get groceries for the trip without them. This is making things hard on everyone." No apology, no curiosity. Just blame wrapped in entitlement. Margaret stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to explain, to pour out the years of neglect, of being seen only when needed. But she didn't. Instead, she slipped on her coat, stepped outside, and walked toward the garden. The air was crisp. The roses she had planted years ago when Aaron had just gotten married were still growing. Some were bent, some had faded, but others bloomed defiantly, untouched by time. She reached out, brushing her fingers along the petals. She whispered to herself, "I'm still here." The garden didn't need her explanation. It simply grew, stubborn, soft, and real, just like her. Later that day, she finally responded to Elise's message. It was short, direct, and unlike anything she'd ever said before. "Maybe it's time you all learned how to do things without relying on me." She pressed send, and then came the call. It was Aaron. "Mom, why are you doing this?" he asked, frustration lacing his voice. "You're making a scene over nothing." "It's just a trip." Just a trip. The words sliced through her, not because they were cruel, but because they were careless. And carelessness, Margaret knew, could hurt more deeply than anger ever could. "Do you realize how much I've done for you both?" she asked, her voice trembling but unwavering. "How many times I've been there, but it's never enough, is it? You don't even see me anymore." There was silence on the other end. A silence thick with realization. "Mom, we didn't mean to make you feel like that." "I don't need anything from you, Aaron," she said gently. "But maybe it's time you understood I deserve something too, respect." She ended the call. Her hands were shaking, but her soul felt still. Margaret didn't cry that night. She didn't spiral into regret. Instead, she sat with the truth of her words. They were overdue, but they were hers. In the days that followed, her phone rang often. First Aaron, then Elise, then both. She didn't answer, not out of spite, but because she was no longer rushing to make others comfortable at her expense. Then one quiet afternoon, a knock came at the door. It wasn't Aaron. It wasn't Elise. It was Claire, Aaron's aunt, warm, gentle Claire who had always been the bridge in tense moments. Margaret opened the door, unsure of what she'd hear. Was she here to scold? To guilt? But Claire simply said, "Can we talk?" They sat in the kitchen, two women with shared history, shared scars. Claire looked around the house, noticing the subtle changes. The open windows, the fresh flowers. The way the light now pooled gently in the corners. "I came to say I understand," she said softly. "You've given so much, and somewhere along the way we all forgot to give back." Margaret's breath caught. It wasn't just the words, it was the acknowledgement. Someone had seen her. She didn't speak for a moment. She let the quiet wash over them. "You're not invisible, Margaret," Claire added, placing a hand gently over hers. "You never were. We just stopped looking." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, but they didn't fall. They weren't the tears of heartbreak. They were the tears of release. They talked for hours, not about blame, not about who owed what, but about change. About how the small, quiet choices we make to stand up for ourselves can ripple outward in ways we never expect. "You're allowed to want more," Claire said before leaving. "More than just being needed. You're allowed to be wanted." That night, Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, her heart both full and fragile. She thought about what Claire had said, about the shift that had begun not just in her family, but in her. She had been waiting for someone to rescue her from invisibility. Now she was rescuing herself. And this was only the beginning. The days following Claire's visit moved slowly, but something had changed. It wasn't dramatic. No grand gestures or sweeping apologies. But in the stillness, Margaret felt a subtle shift within herself, like the quiet snapping of a thread that had held her in place for years. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to explain herself. She didn't feel responsible for everyone's comfort. She simply lived. Each morning, she brewed her tea and sat in the soft light by the window, watching the world unfold. She picked up books she had long abandoned, cooked meals just for herself, and went for long walks down roads she used to drive past in a hurry. It felt strange at first, choosing herself, but also it felt like coming home. And then one afternoon, the inevitable happened. Her phone buzzed again. It was Aaron. This time the message was different. "Mom, I've been thinking, I'm sorry for how I've treated you. We've all been selfish. Elise didn't mean to hurt you, she's just been caught up in her world. But that's no excuse. I want to make things right. Can we talk?" Margaret read the message several times. It was honest, vulnerable. But it didn't erase the years of neglect, the weight of being sidelined over and over again. Still, something about it made her pause. Maybe he meant it. Maybe he was finally seeing her. She typed slowly, deliberately. I'm glad you're thinking about this, Aaron, but I can't just forget everything. You and Elise need to understand I've spent years giving, supporting, being your safety net. I'm not your backup plan anymore. She added one final line, one that had taken her a lifetime to learn how to say. I won't go back to what we had unless things truly change. When she pressed send, a calm settled over her. She didn't feel victorious, she didn't feel bitter, she just felt aligned. Later that day, a knock echoed through the quiet of the house. It was Aaron. He stood on the porch, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand, awkwardly held, petals slightly bent from the wind. Mom, he began, voice soft, I know this doesn't fix everything, but I wanted to show up. I wanted you to see that I'm trying. Margaret took the flowers gently, setting them aside. I appreciate that, she said. But this has to be more than flowers. It has to be more than words. I know, he replied, and I'm ready. They sat at the table, no longer mother and son in a power struggle, but two people trying to rebuild something real. Aaron admitted what Margaret had long suspected, that Elise hadn't truly understood how her actions had hurt. That he, too, had overlooked his mother's quiet strength, mistaking her resilience for indifference. I just assumed you'd always be there, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. That's the thing about being dependable, she said. People forget you have limits. They talked long into the evening. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't tidy. But it was real, and for the first time, Margaret felt like she wasn't just being heard, she was being understood. In the days that followed, Aaron kept his word. He called more often, stopped by unannounced with pastries or stories from work. He asked about her not out of obligation but out of genuine care, but Elise remained distant. Margaret didn't expect her to change overnight. Some silences take longer to break. Still, the gap between them felt undeniable. Until one quiet morning, Margaret received a message. Mom, it read, I know things have been strained. I've been thinking a lot. I'd like to invite you to the lake house this weekend. Just us. No expectations, just time. Together. Margaret sat with the message for a long while, her hands wrapped around her tea. It was unexpected, and yet not unwelcome. She typed her reply with steady hands. I'll come, but let's make this a new beginning, one where we all matter. Equally. The response came quickly, I want that too. That weekend, as she drove toward the lake house, memories flooded back of laughter, of holidays spent around the fire, of the years before silence took root. The weight of those memories clung to her shoulders, but so did something else, hope. When she arrived, Elise and Aaron greeted her warmly, not out of politeness, not out of guilt, but with a quiet joy that spoke louder than any apology. They spent the weekend playing board games, cooking meals together, sitting by the fire and talking, really talking, about what had gone wrong, about what could be better, about what they wanted to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. And as Margaret sat on the porch that final night, the stars reflecting in the lake's still surface, she felt something lift. Not all the pain, not all the history, but the guilt, the fear, the need to be more than she was just to feel seen. She had said her truth, they had heard it, and that, for now, was enough. Returning from the lake house, Margaret felt different, not dramatically, not in the way movies would portray someone walking into a sunrise utterly transformed, but in the way a person feels after they've taken a deep breath for the first time in years, steady, present, and no longer holding back the parts of themselves that had been tucked away. She was quiet on the drive home, letting the soft hum of the tires and the rhythm of her thoughts carry her forward. The past weekend had not been easy, but it had been honest. That alone felt like a victory. The road ahead wasn't clear. Forgiveness, trust, rebuilding, these things were not simple or linear. But Margaret knew now that she didn't need to carry the full weight of the journey alone. She stepped back into her home and paused at the threshold. The stillness, once so sharp and isolating, now felt gentle. The house hadn't changed, but she had. She began reclaiming her days not as a mother waiting to be included, but as a woman rediscovering her rhythm. She wrote in her journal each morning. She learned how to bake something new every week. She went to the park with a thermos of tea and a book. These were small things, but they were hers. A few days later, a call came through from Aaron. Just wanted to check in, Mom, he said. No reason, just missed you. She smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. Thank you, she said simply. That means a lot. Their conversations became more frequent, less about obligations, more about presence. He asked her for recipes, stories from her youth. He even stopped calling her just Mom. Sometimes she was Margaret, with a softness that meant he saw her as more than a role. But with Elise, progress was slower. The lake house had been a truce, not a resolution. There were no calls, no visits, not yet. Margaret didn't chase it. She had stopped chasing. One afternoon, Claire called again. "There's something I've been thinking about," she said. "Maybe we should have a family meeting. You, Aaron, Elise, and me, not for confrontation, but for clarity, for healing." Margaret hesitated. "I don't know if Elise is ready for that," she replied. "Maybe not," Claire admitted. But sometimes the act of showing up is the first step toward understanding. Margaret agreed, reluctantly, carefully. The meeting was set for the following Sunday at Claire's house. As Margaret entered the living room that day, she could feel the tension coiled in the air. Elise sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded tightly. Aaron gave Margaret a small, encouraging nod. Claire, ever the peacemaker, sat between them, her posture both firm and open. Margaret broke the silence. "You've treated me like I didn't matter," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Like I only existed when it was convenient. I've carried that for too long." Elise looked up sharply, then away. "I didn't mean to," she murmured. "I guess I didn't realize how far things had gone." "That's the problem," Margaret replied. "No one realized. Or worse, no one wanted to." Claire spoke next. "Elise, this isn't about blame, it's about acknowledgement. Margaret has been the one holding everything together for years. But that strength came at a cost." Elise looked down at her hands, her jaw tight. "I didn't know it had gotten that bad." "And that's why we're here," Margaret said. "To stop pretending everything is fine when it's not." Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with truths that had finally been spoken. After a long pause, Elise looked up, eyes softer than before. "I'm sorry," she said. "I really am. I've been selfish, focused on everything but family, but I want to change that. If you'll let me." It wasn't an excuse, it wasn't dramatic, it was sincere. Margaret nodded. "I'm willing, but it can't just be words, I need to see the effort." The meeting ended with no fireworks, no hugs. But Margaret left feeling lighter. A weight had been named. And in naming it, they had all begun to loosen its grip. In the weeks that followed, Elise started reaching out tentatively at first. A message asking for a recipe. A photo of Jasper curled up by the fire. Then a phone call. "Hi Margaret," Elise said. "Would you like to join us for dinner this weekend? Nothing fancy, just us." Margaret paused, then smiled. "Yes. I'd like that." The dinner wasn't perfect, but it was real. They talked, laughed, even disagreed, and it was okay. For once, the room felt balanced. Afterwards, as Margaret walked to her car, Aaron caught up to her. "Thank you for giving us another chance," he said. "I'm not giving chances anymore," Margaret replied. "I'm setting expectations." Aaron laughed softly. "Fair enough." And she meant it. Margaret had finally stepped into her own life, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who had already chosen herself. And in doing so, she'd given her family the opportunity to choose her too, not because they needed her, but because they finally saw her. The seasons began to shift. Summer's warmth mellowed into the golden hush of autumn, and with it, so did the pace of Margaret's days. The vibrant leaves outside her window reminded her of something Claire had once said: "We're allowed to shed what no longer serves us." Margaret had shed silence. She had shed guilt. She had shed the weight of being the one who always waited. And now, in this chapter of her life, she was not rebuilding the old. She was creating something entirely new. She had started going to a small writing group at the local library, a circle of women who, like her, were relearning how to use their voices. They met every Thursday, reading poetry, sipping tea, laughing over memories they had never shared before. It was in that space, among kindred spirits, that Margaret began to feel seen, not just as a mother or wife or caretaker, but as herself. She wrote about gardens, about silence, about the taste of freedom in a warm slice of pie on a quiet afternoon. Her words were quiet, but they were hers, and they mattered. Aaron visited regularly now, sometimes with Jasper, sometimes just to sit with her in the garden and talk. He didn't try to fix things anymore. He listened. He asked questions. He remembered her favorite stories. Elise, too, was trying. She hadn't become someone new overnight, but she had softened. She called with real questions, asked for advice without expectation, offered help before it was requested. The biggest change, Margaret realized, wasn't just in them, it was in how she responded. She didn't rush to fill silence. She didn't leap to solve everything. She didn't ignore her own needs. She had learned to pause, to breathe, to say, "Let me think about it," and mean it. One evening, as the first frost kissed the grass outside her window, Margaret received a message from Elise. "We're planning a weekend at the coast, just us. Would you like to come?" There was no obligation, no guilt, just an invitation. She read it once, then again. She didn't hesitate this time. "Yes," she typed. "Thank you for including me." When they arrived at the coast that weekend, the wind was sharp and the sky endless. The cottage was modest, wooden walls, creaky floors, the kind of place that made you want to slow down and savor every sound. They spent the days walking along the beach, collecting shells, cooking together without the chaos of old tension. Evenings were spent by the fireplace, wrapped in soft blankets and quiet laughter. On the final night, Elise handed Margaret a photo. It was one she hadn't seen before, a candid shot of her sitting with Jasper in the garden, the sunlight dancing through her silver hair, her eyes closed in peace. "I took this last month," Elise said. "You looked content." Margaret held the photo gently, her eyes glistening. "I was." That night, as the wind howled gently outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Margaret sat with her family, not as the forgotten one, not as the fixer, but as someone who had finally taken her place at the center of her own life. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't begging to be seen. She was living, fully, softly, bravely. In the weeks and months that followed, life continued, not perfectly, but purposefully. Margaret planted new roses in her garden. She took a short trip by herself to the countryside, where she wrote for hours and wandered through old bookstores. She learned how to be alone without being lonely. She learned how to speak without shrinking. She learned that love given freely, not out of duty, but out of recognition, was the only kind that healed. And as winter gave way to spring once more, Margaret walked barefoot across the dewy grass one morning, coffee in hand, heart unburdened. The world hadn't changed entirely, but she had, and that made all the difference. As she stood there watching the light break across the horizon, a single thought drifted through her mind like a prayer, like a promise. "I am no longer invisible."